How many perspectives can a single man have? I see, said the blind man. He couldn't see at all, as my father would say. This talk is an objective, subjective look at cognition through a non-absolute-absolutist viewpoint. In other words, Andrew Walker's viewpoint. I would say this talk is dense in meaning. Others would say it's just dense. In my not so humble opinion, they would be wrong. Some quotes that have relevance to begin with, starting with one of mine. My theory of everything states everything is relevant, but it would take eternity to make all the connections to achieve a state of omniscience, if indeed that were possible. This leaves us vainly attempting to make all these connections as we grasp for knowledge of our existence. I believe as we do this, we slip between a perceived objective model of reality and a perceived subjective model of reality, often without any awareness of the transition. That is just one of the transition modes of being us humans regularly flow between as we utilize language and attempt to cognize reality. In other words, turn experience into meaning. Objectivism, not Ayn Rand's version, but my version, is the conflating of a perceived solid object with a perceived factual idea. In other words, treating a perceived subjective fact as a solidly and rigorously proven scientific fact through the mental gymnastics cognition is apparently so good at. Considering that when any object at the basis of its existence is constructed more by waves of energy than the particles we perceive and feel through our senses, it is not surprising we may conflate subjective with objective. The aim of this talk is to hopefully to join a few more dots together in a useful manner. This is for you all to judge for yourself. Some more quotes from other people that have influence embedded within them, as does all language. What is the definition of evidence? And what is the evidence of that definition? Evan Kim from the Facebook group called Epistemology came up with that one. Derek Mazzone in his Pursuit of Value channel on YouTube came up with the concept of a value state. I just added, meaning is a value state. My mother came up with, that's just one of those things, in a voice of wonderment, or was it bewilderment? Frequently followed by a second quote of hers, which was exactly the same, only completely different. Abraham/Esther Hicks came up with satisfaction as a state of mind, not a state of condition. Bill Hendry spoke of brittle literalism and fractionated things when he gave a book review of David Blome's Wholeness and the Implicate Order. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of the interactions that have influenced my thinking throughout my life. William Shakespeare said, "Nothing is good nor bad, but thinking makes it so." He also said, "Though this be madness, yet there is method in it." A final quote from another for the moment, one lifted from Remco van Satten's address to the Existential Society in May 2025. Knowledge is a practical tool for the prediction of... Sorry, I'll read that again. Knowledge is a practical tool for prediction, and that's it. He was quoting someone else when he said that. I don't know who. That quote I'm in agreement with until influenced otherwise, and inevitably I will be. In fact, I have many counter arguments to that one without diminishing the truth that I see within it. These quotes simply demonstrate that words influence us all, and each one of us differently, at the least, to consider their meanings, either consciously or unconsciously. I say all worldly creation is a co-creation of self, other, and what is. And this theme echoes throughout my thinking. So let's dive into this madness and see if our sensors/senses can make sense. Two traditional words I utilize in different forms throughout my thinking, which are harder to distinguish between when verbalized rather than when seen in written form. In the traditional use, what is means asking for information on something specific. However, when I utilize the compound version of what is, I am referring to all that was, all that is now, and all that is possible in the future. In other words, an omniscient worldview, unachievable by humanity because our knowledge base at any point in time is never complete in any lifetime we know of. What is also the metaphor for one of my locuses of control, which will become more apparent as you learn more about my thinking. Like the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, but what is that can be conceived of as true is not the absolute truth. Similar to any perceived omni-God that can be named negates any other God. The three examples just illustrated, while similar, are completely different, but are prime examples of the ineffable that can only be glimpsed. The word what is by itself should be sufficient to indicate self and other as being parts of the whole of existence. But because of the fractionated nature of our perception, the words self and other must be included to differentiate the fractions of existence, which is all that humanity is capable of perceiving. In fact, the fractionated nature of humanity's perception, thinking, and language usage will be clearly on display throughout my talk as I attempt to join numerous new ideas together, despite there being nothing new under the sun, supposedly. You could blame some disjointedness in my talk on my bad command of English. I believe that is not absolutely correct. It is somewhat correct. I also believe it shall take many retellings with input from audiences to achieve better coherence of thought than my initial attempts do. But this appears to be the nature of humanity's ever-changing zeitgeists, co-created. My apologies for occasionally using obscure words like zeitgeist. Hopefully our internal memory of their meanings match sufficiently, or at least eventually match sufficiently for mutual comprehension. Any difficulty we have comprehending one another is compounded by a subjective fact that many dispute, that I believe is true. Any word we use in communication, any word we use to communicate with can have its meaning change whenever it is used, and context is always relevant. The change may be so minute that it may be unperceived. Nonetheless, the type and degree of meanings attributed by the contributor to a communication and the receiver of a communication will inevitably have variance, most often without any significant consequence, until it does. I therefore beg your indulgence by attempting to take the whole of my talk into consideration before attempting to dissect it. I attempt at times to include further explanation, and later in the talk there is a bit of a summary, along with some conclusions at the end. Now, without understanding out the way, or at least put on hold, in a nutshell, non-absolute absolutism is the acceptance that nothing is known absolutely, and we are constantly accepting or rejecting our suppositions of what existence and reality are. And life is the drama that plays out between self, other, and what is. As we construct perceived absolutes from our foundational beliefs when it suits. None of the trilogy of self, other, and what is known fully, and life is spent discovering them and utilizing the values discovered within each. The only way a human can get to know the trilogy of self, other, and what is through the senses we have been endowed with as we experience what is existence, past, present, future. It, whatever it is that is conscious, is always a concern of self, other, and what is. And a self is deciding upon the degree of concern and the consequences of decisions made and not made, mainly in ignorance. This is another theme that permeates throughout my talk. Along with the fact that there is a perceived objective self and a perceived subjective self, that our thinking often can't separate and at times often mistakes one for the other. This is a fact I only realised more fully the other day. The implication of this subjective fact are huge and has necessitated some rethinking and rewriting, as happens whenever a paradigm shift occurs, no matter how small. Questioning objectivity does not eliminate the scientific fact, but it has to be seen in a different paradigm where faith in the scientists and their adherence to the scientific method is paramount. And we know that, and we know the fallibility of faith. Acknowledging even rigorous science is contaminated by humanity's bias, good or bad. We all must rely upon other people's educate on other people educated within fields of expertise for much of our information. A conundrum that can at times have us making wrong decisions when weighing up our own capabilities, either way. This conundrum is true for subjective facts as it is true for a scientific fact. Knowing which, sorry about that, knowing which expert to trust in any situation is as difficult as attempting to eliminate one's own biases. However, one needs to do the best they can. Also, questioning objectivity neither confirms nor denies spirituality. In this talk, I share some of my suppositions that have led me to some of my conclusions. When we are born into this world, we have no memory of the sperm or the eggs that was the source of our conception. I assume it's safe to assume. We certainly weren't capable of immediately speaking the language we were born into, and we are reliant upon DNA/genetics for instructions, along with whatever impulses surge throughout our bodies that create our reactions. Learning to interpret the senses we have been equipped with has been an ongoing process, as the actual sensors we have been equipped with have changed throughout this process of being conceived and born into this world of existence. At some point throughout this process, we become aware of our light. We become aware of light and also darkness, along with all the other sensations received through our other senses, otherwise known as senses, which are interpreted to make sense of both the environment and of the self. Medical wisdom believes initially the fetus has no conception of a distinction between self and environment. However, after being born, our inbuilt learning abilities managed a separation of self and other to some degree. Now, in an attempt to explain further my assumptions about the process of cognition of meaning and value, one way to envision a basic form of cognition, meaning, and evaluation is to imagine when the fetus first becomes receptive to light, which is apparently physical because light is made of photons, a basic unit of matter. In other words, light is an objective thing as opposed to any imagined light, which is a subjective thing. If indeed, whether it is possible for a fetus to imagine light before actually experiencing it, which if it was, it would be considered to be a subjective, psychic, or mentally imagined light, I assume. For the moment, let's not get distracted with the debate as to whether the egg and the sperm may have experienced physical or psychic light, and concentrate on how objective physical particle light is processed through a baby's cognition. When the fetus first becomes aware of physical light, whether that is in the womb or outside of it, the baby can only compare it with the lack of light that it has experienced thus far, which for cognition purposes must be categorized by type and degree. The same as applies to every other sensor that the body is equipped with, as they are progressively activated. All of these senses are comparing one sensation after the other to create a sense of what it is that baby is experiencing. The conclusions made are what is assumed as reality until assumed otherwise. This process of comparing one contrasting thing with another creates a memory library of metaphors, similes, or whatever other words is dreamt up to help map reality. While going through this experience, the brain and body complex is querying its experience in an attempt to predict its next best response. A query is a question. How the question is formed and answered is hugely unknown. One can only assume the question and answers are formed in a pre-verbal language sufficient to map reality and create appropriate responses. Within all this accepting and rejecting, the degree of truth contained in all the question and answers the newborn speculates upon is not, I'll read it again. Within all this accepting and rejecting, the degree of truth contained in all the questions and answers the newborn speculates upon is an ongoing question, which initially relies on an instinctual feedback loop for confirmation of true or false. In other words, the fetus in the newborn is self-taught. This ignores any possible influence the mother may have on a fetus before birth. After birth, and once a cultural language is learned, a more conscious questioning starts determining reality, along with its already conceived various meanings and values, all of which were co-created with the unconscious/subconscious instinctual evaluations that remain and are added to as part of any new conscious co-created meanings and values, which have all been co-created via the interactions between self, other, and what is. The paradox inherent in what I've just said is that what is the whole, and any separation of the self or other is a distortion of actual reality. At least this is my lightly held hypothesis, which you may or may not wish to revisit later. In the meantime, as a baby ages, whilst speculating upon its truths and the consequences that it can predict, they do it more consciously, as we all do, whilst utilising our flawed conscious predictive abilities. While predicting what is, we also require reaching a degree of certainty with our choices that will yield a sufficiency of satisfaction from the consequences of our choices. And I've noted here, I shall just repeat what I just said. While predicting what is, we also require reaching a degree of certainty with our choices that will yield a sufficiency of satisfaction from the consequence of our choices. So, in other words, we require a degree of absoluteness, which is a paradox, but life is full of them. and we have to learn to live with them. And we do actually learn to live with them. I would say a paradox is a spectrum which apparently contradicts itself. This would be in keeping with my theory on how we extract meaning from experience by interpreting it, which is to compare one thing to another, categorizing differences along with degrees of difference, building a library of arrays and spectrums within one another. In other words, spectrums within spectrums, arrays within arrays, and mixtures of both combine to create systems within systems, all the while with unknown cognitive mechanisms and algorithms we extract meaning, value, and knowing for the self. Of course, this is all speculation on my part, but I find it helpful in making sense of my senses. Feel free to ponder its value for you. Hopefully what I'm saying shall become clearer as the talk progresses. Or should I say, assuredly so, although it may require some recapping later. Further to metaphors, spectrums, values, meanings, and language, which were explained somewhat in the second talk on my sparsely populated YouTube channel. That video was called 2 of 1, Series 1, Meaning, Knowing, and Value via Non-Absolute-Absolutism. A link to which I shall share here, along with the link to this current one, which can't be done until it's been uploaded, but it will be there. However, I give a brief condensed explanation of it here as a recap as I expand upon it. Metaphor equals a form of comparing one thing to another to extract meaning. If it can be accepted that metaphor and spectrums play a large part in our perceptions, processes, I'll read that again because I didn't like the way I read it. If it can be accepted that metaphor and spectrums play a large part in our perception processes, where two different things are compared to each other and meaning is created through that evaluation of them, it follows that the act of language creation, naming things and giving them labels, in other words, words, reinforces the illusion of perception, and that perception is the act of turning our senses, sensations into meaning, creating the delusion that our illusions are facts that mirror existence. Once we have labeled our experiences, we can revisit them using both our language and imagination, with each revisit causing a rewrite of memory. And as we know, when synapses fire together, they wire together, creating stronger connections after each connection, leaving us vulnerable to influence by hypnosis. Whatever that is. I do know that hypnosis is a natural mode of being that makes us more susceptible to suggestion than at other times, regardless of whether that suggestion is coming from self or another. I also know that our brain's subconsciousness has difficulty separating imagination from that which is considered first-hand perception, reality. This was illustrated to me in Max Fulmalt's book, Psycho-Cybernetics. Other than that, my knowledge of hypnosis is very limited. and mostly learned from listening to others with that ability. But I do know that the use and misuse of language has a large influence on us all. And excuse me, and it behoves all of it to arm ourselves with better understanding of self, other, and what is, to better communicate our experiences and to understand them. What I mean by misuse of language is the reframing of experience other than what it was, either deliberately or inadvertently. In other words, lying, either to ourselves or to others. How best to go about understanding self, other, and what is another open question. But I suppose it will include comparing one thing with another, with sometimes that one thing being a many compounded thing. It's worth noting that this instinctual habit of cognition, utilizing metaphor to create meanings, leaves us susceptible to only comparing two opposing or contrasting things at a time, because it's easier than including more things or compounded things in our cognitive calculations, thus restricting our cognitive abilities at times and having much influence upon our thinking. This is like thinking that something is all good or all bad and missing the nuances, therefore feeling no need to investigate further its goodness or badness. A similar occurrence happens when we divide opinions into left or right views, with a myriad of dividing lines lost in the distinction. Although we do have the capacity to compound things in our semi-conscious cognitive calculations, the ease of not compounding things is seductive at times. In answer to the question of what is philosophy, which I'm asking on your behalf, I say everyone has a philosophy. Philosophy is an examination of the fundamentals of existence, which we all perceive differently. Philosophy is like the personal religion that everyone creates, which guides their actions throughout their life. A religion with a personal law of a collective one serves the purpose that co-created it. As purpose is the creation of a consciousness and purpose can change, therefore religion must change when purposes change. Of course, the struggle over co-created values will ensue. How that struggle is conducted dictates many an outcome, for better or worse. This will continue to be the case as long as the story of what is continues to unfold, until such time as consciousness ceases to exist in any of its forms. This is one of my conclusions. Yours may differ. How this personal religion is created is as mysterious as is how any meaning or thought is created. This mystery begins at the beginning, which no one knows. There are at least basically three contrasting camps of thought here. The first is the Big Bang created everything that has evolved into what it is today. Secondly, a consciousness created an environment for humanity that has evolved into what it is today. Thirdly, something outside our consciousness influences existence, including our own existence. and in spite of our attempts at self-determination, all of which are speculations on what is perceived as evidence, and that evidence cognition interprets further as to its trueness or falseness. Once a conclusion is reached, further speculation occurs, building a library of speculations, often recycled for further testing for whatever degree of true or false can be assessed by whatever test cognition has set up and deemed most suitable by the subconscious. These tests would include testing for coherence to previous beliefs, along with all other previous logical and emotional conclusions. Then feeding it back into the consciousness for further processing. By this method, each individual creates their own metadata, which is self-referential data, which can be shared with other individuals for co-creation of more data, quasi-knowledge, or partial knowledge, because knowledge is never complete, because no human has omniscience in knowledge, and all knowledge is based on the assumption that all previous knowledge that new knowledge is built upon is correct. In other words, all knowledge is built upon assumptions that are framed as factual representations of reality, mirroring our perceptions. This, to me, is true despite a lifetime of being told one should never assume. Get the idea so far? I hope to some degree. Let's look at ideology and locus of control now. Many claim they have no ideology. I would claim that is not true. To me, an ideology is simply the ideas that support the philosophy and ideals that one lives by, some holding their ideas more rigidly than others, or some may say more religiously. This is one area where many mistake their subjectivity for objectivity. Recapping a little here. We all create our own religion of truth we value as we will them to be for ourselves and within our communities, however broad they may be, utilizing the truths generated by the self and those that the self accepts that were generated by others. Further to all that, amongst all our ideas, each of us has a sense of control that we harness to make our decisions. Psychology names that point of control the locus of control. However, this point of control is not a fixed point and varies person to person and from time to time, depending upon circumstance. A non-exhaustive list of possible points of control are self, emotion, thought, others, science, God or a guru, nature, nurture, logic, music, genes, all of which the self is willing to share control with, sometimes, other times not. My favorite locus of control, which myself is prepared to share control with, is what is. In other words, existence itself. Fortunately, I have a hard-won, reasonable relationship with existence. This struggle for governance of self indicates the struggle for ownership of the self and the many forms, frames, excuse me. Yeah, I'll read that again. This struggle of governance of self indicates the struggle of ownership of the self in the many forms / frames in which the self is conceived of as we attempt to predict where the self begins and ends, and in our many attempts at self-determination. Atheism, scientism, and many other isms tend to elevate / worship objectivism as the basis of their subjectively perceived facts, while another alternative view, being theism, tends to elevate / worship the subjective view of a perceived God or guru as the basis of many of their subjective perceived facts. Non-Absolute-Absolutism tends to elevate, worship the subjective view of the self while reflecting upon the subjective view of others, all the while comparing the contradictions in an attempt to ascertain what is for the self and its fellow humans as subjectively solidified through cognition as is possible. Diversity of views is one of humanity's important requirements to make its decisions. This is often lost sight of as things are divided into left or right views, with the myriad of dividing lines lost in the distinctions, while attempting to describe a multifaceted world. We need a diversity of views when need for a diversity of views is lost sight of, combined with our nature of slipping between instinctual, conscious, unconscious, subjective, objective, positive values, negative values, and various other mental meaning modes or states of being and individual experiences, all of which drive the body and the thinking of an individual, as well as those influences other individuals exert while interacting with them. And when overconfidence and certainty of what it is that is being dealt with as well as those influence other individuals, all of which drive the body and thinking of an individual, as well as those influences that other individuals exert when interacting with them. And when overconfidence in certainty of what it is that is being dealt with arises, conflict resolution is at its highest difficulty. If there is a little agreement on what is, stating the obvious, but knowing that the type and degree of disagreement is paramount to resolution. All factions of these isms can slip between an objective view and a subjective view at times without any acknowledgement of or awareness of the switch in paradigm of perception. This is one of the phenomenon of cognition that satisfies the lust of degree for certainty to allow humanity to function within its bubble of knowledge and ignorance, felt as assuredness, while balanced against a degree of lust for uncertainty, felt as novelty. In other words, the paradoxical need for both certainty and uncertainty. Shifting from one paradigm to another can be likened to learning a new language, but indications are that various conflicting paradigms are capable of being entertained within their subconscious before eventually either being accepted or rejected by the conscious self, with the weight of accepting or rejecting varying depending upon the state of thinking at any one time. So we are weighing up things. We are weighing things up constantly, often causing a fluctuating shift in perceived knowledge or ignorance. Knowledge and ignorance being but one of the innumerable spectrums that humanity's cognition faculties must balance and co-coordinate to maintain a degree of stability, of certainty and satisfaction as we attempt to predict and control our future. A human's perception of its experience co-creates meaning for the self and others by experiencing what is, past, present, and future, to the degree that we can, thus creating a framework of understanding which is the basis its decisions and responses for actions, thoughts, and feelings are based upon, with at least conscious calculation and unconscious instinctual calculations playing their parts, multiplied by both memory and imagination. This framework we call knowledge. The degree to which this framework can be shared and agreed upon with others dictates the degree of harmony achieved within a group, and is also dependent upon each individual's understanding the structure of the language used by each participant. The degree of understanding conveyed is affected by the fact that each individual speaks a language of their own, which will vary in the degree that it adheres to the rules and language, grammar, and dogma of a group of any group participants that they belong to. The grammatical accent, if you like, with some having an accent only held by themselves, which makes them only good for talking to themselves. In part, this process of cognizing experience, turning experience into meaning, involves the naming of our experience via creating symbols, words as labels, connecting them together as story, which enables the sharing of our understanding with each other, and also the self when regurgitating memories to the self or to others. This we know is language and communication, whether remembered in written words or uttered verbally or signed through actions or written in symbols apparently encoded through feelings, thoughts, chemicals, and electrical connections. In fact, all senses, including the senses of meaning and imagination, are turned into knowledge. This evaluation is what fuels our motivation of both physical actions and acts of thought, achieved through the channeling of energy through systems co-created by self, other, and what is, producing further physical action or thought, feelings, and meanings. Besides enabling the sharing of experience, any language system reinforces the meaning it has established by the simple retelling of the knowledge gained, regardless as to whether each retelling is within an individual's own mind or an exchange between two or more individuals, always with varying degrees of acceptance and rejection, modifying its meaning or not with each reiteration of any story conceived. Like parasites, we consume others' meanings along with our own creations, excreting that which we find unpalatable to our sense-making senses, nerves and brains, to name but two of our body parts involved. All language evolves to varying degrees through usage and time, often with no conscious awareness of the participants. I think I'm illustrating part of humanity's evolution, which is the creation of conscious and unconscious value concepts that add to the drives that have already come into existence through meaning, which up to some point in history have been mainly about perpetuation of life itself. Why that is, anyone's guess is as good as mine. The attribution afforded to the source of value is only imagined by humanity. In other words, the systems that co-create conscious meanings are largely imagined rather than actually known. Other than instinctual meaning states serving to perpetuate life, cognitive meaning states also serve to influence the feelings about the experience of life in a meta-cycle, or in other words, a self-serving cycle that dictates both good or bad feelings, largely dependent upon awareness and consequence within the ignorance knowledge bubble that cannot be escaped, other than to enter another ignorance / knowledge bubble, with the ultimate escape being unconscious sleep or finally death. So it behoves us all to make their meaning bubbles as accommodating as is possible for all concerned. As a human being moves through the numerous modes of being, like awake, asleep, conscious, unconscious, working, resting, creating meaning, consuming meaning, with the eventual biggest unknown being death, all the while navigating the syncretic knowledge base which we rely upon. A syncretic knowledge base, in other words, is combining experiential, philosophical, religious, cultural, scientific, emotional principles and practices learned from experiencing life into a knowledge base, which is accumulated through the experiencing and processing, decoding, interpreting, concluding in a framing that maps perceived reality. This is what we must rely upon to make decisions and predictions. Our knowledge accumulation appears to be both linear and from and through a loosely hierarchical web of systems of which the connections are not readily apparent to the conscious human being utilizing them. Through this complexity of meaning and values, which are co-created by self, other, and what is, only one of which can exist by itself, that being what is, if I need to spell it out for you, that is my assumption, which may well be wrong. What is may well cease to exist without self and other. Further assuming, throughout this complexity of meaning and value, morality is born with the preservation of self, other, and what is being the priority. This priority is weakened whenever one of the trilogy is singled out as the priority. thus co-creating disharmony with the trilogy of self, other, and what is. The human being has many modes of being through its mental cognition capabilities, four of which I'll focus on for the moment. The first two being working out what is, and working out what to do with what is. The third is evaluating the value found in the first two modes. A fourth mode is the mode of prediction of the future. While all these modes appear to be separate modes, they are so intertwined, they also appear to form a single system in which each mode can be activated in varying sequencing of order. In conclusion, folks, humanity has a pattern recognizing capability in at least three modes. Those being recognizing which was, that which is now, and predicting what can be, all with flaws within their capabilities. Along with those capabilities, humanity also has the capability to both generate and utilize meaning values, as well as the ability to respond and react to what is and deal with the consequence to self, other, and what is, generating both good and bad with the response/ability for our own, others, and what is satisfactory functioning, with the ownership of self, other, and what is devised by us, if we can maintain it. A bit like democracy, don't you think? This responsibility is shared both individually and collectively, while our very existence depends upon it, as we learn to manage our bias and assumptions of what is, modifying the systems within systems where we can and dealing with it where we can't, to the benefit of all as much as is possible. Diversity is required in our leaders and followers, each dependent upon one another, always with the possibility of role switching, even in minor ways. Learning this lesson by all is key to harmony, for all to contribute what is best for self, other, and what is. Because there is no absolute correct way of being other than getting our framing of perceived reality to serve self, other, and what is as best we can. After all, it has to feel right logically to some degree. In other words, getting our feelings and cognition along with our actions aligned and balanced to a sufficient degree of sufficiency while ensuring survival in a form that is possible and satisfactory to self, other, and what is. In doing so, we can't divorce ourselves from our emotions, but we can't overly rely upon them either. Balancing the need to be led and to lead with the need to serve and be served. After all, it's about balancing the known with the unknown, is it not? As we continue in all our attempts at self-determination, as we continually reinterpret the survival of the fittest, as we attempt to fit in with what is, obliged to make our choices as to how we govern self, other, and what is. The question remains, in my mind at least, where is all this heading? I hope you are as amused as I am by it all. And I hope you realize you can stop and pause this video at any time and rewind it, because you can get lost in it. And there's just some questions that I thought were interesting, worth pondering after this talk, as well as pondering the talk itself. Do we create our own religion? Is there a better explanation as to how we cognize knowledge? Are you aware of your locus of control? Is the acceptance of the ideas we can't is the acceptance of the idea we can't experience reality directly possible for the majority all the time? How much will AI affect your understanding of self, other, and what is? Oh, that was interesting. Interdependence slash sovereignty, security, and competition. Only 2 of 3 possible. That's something I just heard of recently, which is worth pondering. How realistic any attempt at self-determination? I don't really want to say that. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll just share that with you. Take note of that. You can. It's an interesting the way the natives remembered their history when they didn't have writing. It's real educational, that one. Anyway, you've seen enough. You can read that if you want to, but don't let it distract you. This stuff is more important. Anyway, I shall leave you now to do whatever you do, and I shall get on with mine as well. Thank you for your attention.